This is Quorum with Quorum's Quorum. My guest today is Jaimie Nawaday. Jaimie is the head of Seward and Kissel's government enforcement and internal investigations practice. I learned about Jaimie from a post she made on LinkedIn about cutting out drinking and her new venture to disrupt the role of alcohol in the practice of law. I myself cut out alcohol more than 5 years ago as an associate, so her venture seems to really capture the moment. I think you'll enjoy learning about how a seasoned white-collar lawyer is finding space for entrepreneurship. This is a great episode for exploring the nexus between personal and professional growth. Jaimie, thanks for coming on. I was really struck by your LinkedIn presence. You did something that I've never seen before, which is it seems to me, took the effort to share your story in a skillfully produced way about your experience with drinking and then choosing to no longer drink, and then sharing that story about your work as a lawyer in this new format. So you have this new business venture called Disrupting Drinking. I was so struck with that, and I'd love to hear a little bit about what Disrupting Drinking is, and so we can talk some more about the impact it has on you and what you see for the legal profession.
Sure. Disrupting Drinking is my new speaking venture, and it's also just an initiative to get the word out kind of in corporate America about the high pressure drinking culture, which to some extent has eased in the last few years, but there is the expectation, certainly in law, in finance, in consulting, in law enforcement, in all of these adjacent fields, that the professional world requires drinking, and often drinking hard liquor. In the case of, say, prosecutors in certain areas of law in particular, I would say especially trial law work and criminal law work, we see especially high levels of drinking and drinking hard liquor. And I sort of was the first, I was the first lawyer in my family and had a certain amount of imposter syndrome, as we all do. And when you have imposter syndrome, you look around and see what everybody's doing. And in the legal world, that was drinking. And so I really wasn't a lawyer. I really wasn't a drinker before I was a lawyer, but I, started out with wine. And then when I switched to the U.S. Attorney's Office, I noticed that everybody was drinking scotch and bourbon, and I started drinking bourbon, whiskey as well. And over the course of a few years, I just noticed that I was just drinking too much too often. It was basically a nightly habit. It wasn't that I was drinking so much at any given time. I wasn't a huge binge drinker or anything like that, but I knew it was too much, and I knew I was too attached to it, and it was holding me back. And it was hard for me to quit on my own. And I didn't feel like I could tell anyone about it. Certainly with background checks and things like that you have at the U.S. Attorney's Office, it felt like something I had to keep secret. I had to quit sort of through willpower alone. And that was really tough. And so I looked around just in media, on YouTube, in bookstores, for stories of people who drank like me and had quit on their own. And I really couldn't find that story. And after I quit in late 2020, I started thinking about how much better my life had gotten once I quit. And I started thinking back on that period of time when I was trying and failing to quit, and how a story like mine would have really helped me back then. And I used to just write in my journal New Year's resolutions and things like that, resolve to drink less, or only drink twice a week or something like that. And I just kept failing. And I think I would have quit years earlier had I heard someone share a story like mine earlier. So that's what led to Disrupting Drinking.
Yeah, and so much of that resonates for me. I quit drinking roughly the same timeline, about a year earlier. And so for me, it was definitely connected to practice. So I was too broken before law school and in law school to drink much, and then finally could afford, alcohol. And I noticed my first year is definitely a stressful year. And I was going through like a bottle of bourbon a week, and I had the weight gain to show for it. And I was just like blown away from that. But so then I kind of pulled back from that, and it was fine for a while. But then, in 2019, I noticed I was really in a cycle of caffeine to get me through the day and then alcohol at the end of the night, and just the cycle wouldn't end. So then I cut out both at the same time. And yeah, I very much agree with you that, there's just not a variety of stories about not drinking. I think first it's very abstract. Like when you're in law school or in practice, like there's some CLE you go to or whatever, they say, hey, by the way, too much drinking in the profession. Like, okay, like just 1 in 3 lawyers has an issue with drinking. Like, okay, like I get all these numbers, but it's not tangible. And so, yeah, I think hearing stories from successful lawyers like yourself to say like, hey, like you thrived in government practice, you're thriving in private practice. Hearing stories from lawyers like yourself would definitely change a lot. I'm curious if you think that, how much has changed since the pandemic. Of course, there's a lull. I think any number of people were drinking a lot at home. I think there's lots of figures that showed drinking went up a lot, which, is not surprising.
Right.
And then, so since then, now people are, of course, it's been at least a couple of years, if not several, that people have been getting back together for conferences. Do you think have you noticed a change before and after, pre-pandemic, post-pandemic, in terms of how much drinking seems to be part of legal culture?
I mean, during the pandemic, just anecdotally, it seemed to be going way up. I guess just the way people were joking about it, sort of drinking a much earlier hour in the day and sort of throughout the day. And, people having a lot of wine tastings, like Zoom wine tastings and things like that to socialize. And then I saw just statistics on how much worse problem drinking was during the pandemic, and emergency room visits around drinking and things like that. So during the pandemic, it seems to be getting a lot worse. Then I guess it wasn't immediately after the pandemic, but just the last few years, it seems like there has been a shift, because we hear more and more about Gen Z drinking in much lower numbers. Dry January seems to be getting more and more popular every year. I seem to hear from more and more people now that they've quit drinking or have cut way back on drinking. I noticed that the mocktail menus are getting better and better. It seemed like it was really hard a few years ago to find even in Brooklyn, to find real mocktail menus. And now we have non-alcoholic bars, they're non-alcoholic spirit stores, and pretty much every restaurant seems to have a decent mocktail menu.
Yeah, you definitely noticed that. And there's still vestiges of it. I mean, I was at a conference recently, so my wife was with the conference with me, and my wife is pretty clearly visibly pregnant. And she had seltzer, I had seltzer. Somebody walked up to me and said, "Oh, are you not drinking out of solidarity?" It's just the default assumption is that you would be drinking.
Right.
That is what the assumption is that what you would be doing.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's especially true at conferences. So to go back to your original question, I think I've seen changes in society, but I think the legal profession in particular is still lagging way behind. I think a lot of firm events, networking events, conferences they're starting, as more people are making noise about it and making the requests for non-alcoholic options, they're starting to include them more. But still, the socializing still revolves around drinking.
Yeah, I wonder if, I don't think there's going to be any clear answers to why there's a disconnect between drinking law beyond the obvious, hey, it's a stressful job. There's many stressful jobs. And yes, we have enough income, and so to be able to afford alcohol. So there's lots of answers for it. But I wonder if part of, you mentioned, I've consistently understood that Gen Z is drinking less. And from my experience with people that are of that generation, yeah, they drink way less. And I'm so struck with it because I know that at that age, I was trying to drink as much as possible. And so was everyone else that I knew. It was just a given, an assumption. And so I think some of it has to do with just a general interest in health that is, a secular trend in health, that people are more and more interested in health as we go along. But I wonder to what extent drinking culture is tied to, work culture in kind of binding you to work, in every sense. And so, I mean, the extreme version of it is you see this in, Japan and I think South Korea as well, where in Japan, there's a concept of a salaryman. And so the salaryman culture is like, it's I think from the US's vantage point, a very extreme culture where you're expected to work long hours for sure, but then also spend a lot of time after hours socializing and drinking a lot.
Right.
And so probably from seeing something that seems like a more extreme example, you can understand how it works on that spectrum at all. And I think it seems to be part of the history of the reason that drinking and legal practice was so tied together was to bind you to your work. So it was a way of like, hey, like just the same socialization we were just talking about, but then also like, you're barely able to get by, right? You're not able to thrive. You're not able to, so you're just, the only thing you have energy for is work the next day. Like, okay, you just survive that day of drinking. And now like the only thing that you don't have energy to work out or maybe show up in an extra way for family or friends or whatever. So work is going to be the number one priority. And so it's a tacitly perverse way to like bind you to work. But I wonder if you've observed that because that's something that I'm noticing.
That's interesting. I mean, it resonates, especially in the trial context, I think, because, alcohol, of course, it doesn't really reduce stress or anxiety. People now understand, but it feels like it does in the moment, right? For the first hour, first half hour, right? So if you're working long hours at a trial, you're so high adrenaline and your nerves are so high all day long. And what's going to shut that off immediately feels like, well, a really strong drink, right? And so you can see how the culture would start is, it's the way you can power down very quickly once you're done with trial prep for the next day. But then you have that and you become worthless very quickly. So you go home, you collapse asleep, you just get up and you do it all over again. You're not going to have, you want to shut down quickly. It feels like the quick fix, but then you're not going to be doing anything else productive. You're not really engaging with your family in any meaningful way. You're not going to go exercise or anything else. You're just going to collapse and then do it all over again, like you said.
Yeah. And so tell me about how you're approaching it. So you are a partner at a litigation boutique, and so you've got a busy practice. How are you working in this venture into your practice?
I guess around Memorial Day, I just started setting aside time on evenings and weekends. And I'm fortunate. My kids are teenagers now. And they get around on the subway. So I don't spend, all evening having to chauffeur them around to different places. They get around on their own. And I have a super short commute. It's about 10 minutes from downtown Brooklyn to downtown Manhattan. So I'm fortunate enough that I have a little more free time than I had when, say, the kids were younger, and just kind of mapped out little by little what it would take. And it felt much more realistic, I guess, and much more compatible with a legal practice to plan talks and workshops to do sort of a speaking gig as a side gig, as opposed to, say, writing a book, which just felt much more daunting and would have taken a lot more time. To sit down and draft an hour keynote is much more realistic when you have a full-time job.
What I also like about that is like, there's just, you don't have any clue like what the demand is for this book, but like a talk is something that it's discreet, and then you can quickly get some feedback from an audience and then learn what resonated in that. And maybe you do a dozen of those, 20, 100 of those, and at some point you'll understand, okay, let's say there's book to be written here. Then now I understand there's an audience for it. And, some of them have already heard me speak before on this. And then you're also able to like iterate on on what we were talking about, is just like what people are looking for. And so can you say some more about some of the groups that you think your message would be helpful for?
I think law students for sure, because we all heard about in law school the rates of problem drinking among lawyers, and I'm head of associate recruiting now at my firm. And so I was at a recruiting event recently at a law school, and we got to talking about drinking and disrupting drinking also. And a lot of the students I spoke with don't themselves drink for one reason or another. And they were saying that they now have law school classes where you get the old look to your left, look to your right. I think it used to be something like one of you will drop out of law school, but now it's like one of you will develop a problem with alcohol. And I said, and what guidance were you given in terms of how to avoid this? And they said, well, we didn't really get any, just sort of the cautionary tale, the cautionary statistic, that sort of thing. So definitely, I think law schools can benefit from this because we're scaring them, but we're not really giving them the tools yet. And I think to hear relatable stories and here's what happened to me and here's what I wish I had known and here's how I could have set myself up for a different trajectory in terms of that lifestyle, they are super beneficial. Also, incoming classes of associates or employees, I'm a lawyer, so obviously the initial audience is lawyers, but people in other industries face the same kind of pressure, especially other long hour, high stress jobs like, finance is another obvious one. Consulting is another obvious one. But I would say it can be bar associations, firm retreats, groups of partners, team building exercise, wherever you're getting a group of people together in the professional setting, that's potentially my audience. Anybody who cares about mental health, wellness, any of those issues, drinking is tied into that. So if you're getting a group together to talk about any of those issues, I think that's a group that I can add value and speak to.
What I like so much about that is the drinking there's definitely a key part of it that is solo, but of course, so much of the drinking is in a group context. So probably speaking to a group about, hey, here's an awareness for every single person here about the influence of this group on you. It allows all these people to individually and collectively choose different behaviors. And so it's so timely. Like you're speaking to them in the moment when that information is most relevant. It's just in time information that's the most helpful to them.
Right. And there's an obvious value proposition for firms and companies because, it's drinking is just costing them all a ton of money, not just in terms of actual alcohol that they're spending at events or on firm sponsored after parties and things like that, but just, sick days, loss of productivity, workplace incidents, almost, throughout my career, every workplace incident I've been a part of on a case or seen it at some, wherever I was, always involves alcohol, things like that. And women are so often on the receiving end of that and of those incidents. And so it's also just important for kind of diversity and inclusion, retention initiatives as well.
Yeah, I was searching for something on my phone through a conversation and I stumbled on an old thread with a former coworker and so I just was immediately plunged into just like, our world years ago. I was just scrolling through it and it was amazing how much like we were talking about poor behavior of partners and just how much it was associated with alcohol. This just happened this past week and it was just such a stark reminder of the associations you're talking about. Can we talk a little more about, so you mentioned some of the context, for you personally in terms of, hey, like my children are a little more self-sufficient, so I have some space to take on. Can you say some more about, you've been in several firms in private practice, you've been in government practice, so you've had, a rounded out professional, career so far. I don't know many, I'm just not thinking of any lawyers I know that have developed this sort of speaking bureau engagement platform venture. And so can you tell me some more about how you came to, you talked a little about to say, hey, I realized it wasn't a book here, but there's potentially a speaking opportunity here. I see so little of practicing lawyers doing something like that. So how did you even come up with the idea of like, hey, this is a thing? Like I can do this, I can speak and get paid to speak and add value in that way. Like, how did you come to that idea?
That's a good question. I think some of it was probably a combination of things. Some of it was going to partner retreats and, we, as all firms do, you bring in outside speakers on a range of topics. And so, I knew it was a thing for law firms and elsewhere. And then just sort of seeing, public speaking courses and gigs and things like that. I must have been talking about it or something, because suddenly it seemed my social media feed was full of it. And then I started poking around at some of those classes and kind of seeing what I wanted to see, what does the market already have in terms of people speaking on this topic. I started looking around on TED Talks and other things, and it really seemed like there are obviously lots of resilience speakers, grit, all these wellness speakers, but I did see that there was a gap around drinking. And I thought, with my background, doing trial work, doing a lot of public speaking, it just seemed like a natural fit.
And then so you saw the opportunity for how your skill set would be valuable to other people. What did you identify as the payoff to you? And of course, it will change over time, but just heading into the venture, I want to replicate that decision for anybody else that has an entrepreneurial instinct and looking for, inspiration from what you're doing right now. What was the early value that you identified that you would get out of this?
I think it just felt like something I had to do. I think just in order to be fulfilled. It's very satisfying to me when somebody says, when you told that story, it had this effect on me. It gave me hope. It inspired me in some way. And I've had that in different contexts. For instance, since I quit drinking, over the past few years, I would sometimes post on social media different athletic things I was doing as part of different health kicks, but I wasn't really sharing the drinking part of my story at that point. I mentioned that I had stopped drinking sort of as part of a health kick or a health challenge. But a lot of people would tell me, I've been inspired by your social media posts and I started doing this and that's always been very gratifying to me, super meaningful. And then I was at a conference last spring. It was a diversity conference, and we talked about one of the panels was on socioeconomic diversity, and there was a panel on that we don't give enough airtime to people who grew up without money. Like, we're sort of focusing on racial diversity and all these other things that we should be focusing on, but we don't often talk about what it's like to enter the law firm world when you grew up without money and how foreign that world can feel when you don't know the types of food you're eating, when you don't feel sophisticated, these fancy restaurants that you go to suddenly as a summer associate and that sort of thing. So I told my story about growing up, maybe we'll say barely middle class in central Pennsylvania, and what it was like when I was a summer associate and not knowing how to eat the food and what it was, and sort of feeling a little bit like a hillbilly. And again, like, when people came up to me after that panel and said how much my story resonated, how they felt seen and understood, I just love those moments of connection. Like, that's what I enjoy so much about getting up in front of people and telling a story. So, and just knowing that stories can really help someone change their own lives. And so what I got out, I guess what I saw myself getting out of it was just knowing that I could help someone or give someone else hope, because I know what it was like when I was trying to quit. And it was a very scary and lonely place to be. And so if I could help someone else out of that, that would mean the world to me.
Where in central Pennsylvania did you grow? I went to school in Pittsburgh.
Oh, I grew up in a small town outside of Allentown.
Okay. Not so far away from Pittsburgh.
Right.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I think you're right. I think stories are what help people really change their minds. We are really, most influenced by stories, not data, right?
Right.
And in terms of, you already will be exercising skills that you already have from, the public speaking skills are things that you already have. Are there any other professional benefits that you see for yourself from pursuing this?
Um, That's tough to say. I mean, potentially, right? I mean, apart from the obvious, somebody can pay me to come speak. But really, I think it's a huge benefit to all of us if we start to change the legal industry and everybody feels a little more included and they don't have to stress about how am I going to navigate this event. And when I was at this recruiting event recently, some students told me that they've been secretly stressed out about how they're going to navigate the law firm world as a non-drinker. And they shouldn't have to worry about that. I mean, there's enough stress that you deal with as a young lawyer, just, the hours and whether I make a mistake and whether a privileged document goes out the door and all the things that you worry about as a junior associate. The last thing you should have to worry about is, are people, am I going to be held back in some way if people know I don't drink alcohol? That's crazy.
I think what I really like about this, adding this to the conversation of legal practice is because, so many interviews you see in, major legal media publications or at bar, if you're good at a bar association kinds of interviews do, it's, fairly formulaic about the career decisions that somebody makes. And so it's just based on the analytical qualities of one option or another. Like you and I could jump in that right now, and I can ask you, well, tell me about, why you went to Seward and Kissel, and tell me why you went to the U.S. government. And and those are definitely a key part of course, the career decisions we make is, some analysis of the payoff. We're doing it right now, talking about disrupting drinking. What's the payoff? So yes, these kinds of things are part of our careers for sure and helpful to share. But what I like what you're doing is, you've identified drinking as this nexus of all these different forces in law and all these different, so I mean, like, why do we drink? We drink, in key part to relieve the stress of the kinds of work we're doing. Okay. What is stressing out? You just say, well, okay, like, am I going to blow some privilege issue, or am I gonna just like I'm really worried about this brief, and there's only so much I can spend time writing on it. And so it's a juncture point to say, okay, how are you practicing? Is there some other way that's better to practice? It's inconceivable that the only way to practice is pressure, 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 do an amazing job. Like there's got to be other ways that we can relate to each other and get excellent work, meaningful work. And so I think it is a useful touchstone to hit on a lot of areas of fulfillment and excellence in the practice. So I think there's I think adding this will really be, I think, very enriching for just getting people to have conversations and take pressure off and figure out other solutions for what's really driving this behavior of drinking.
Right.
Well, I think it would be helpful for a little context for your practice to understand how you got here. And of course, talking about experiences you had with drinking could be relevant to that too. But I guess we can start with going into government. Can you talk a little about why you went to the U.S. Attorney's Office? Like, what were your goals heading into this, and talk about some of your experiences there? Because you mentioned the context of drinking. That was kind of you felt like you're joining a new culture and, wanted to fit in. So tell me about that change, because you were already in private practice, exposed to that world, found a new world in government practice. Tell me about the differences that you saw between those two worlds, even as an experienced litigator at that time.
Yeah. I guess I thought about, I'm not sure my early stage career choices were the most thoughtful. I think a lot of it was, right, opening up the vault, looking at rankings, and then, somebody tells, or having certain mentors who said, here's what you need to do. You need to go to this type of firm, then you need to go to the U.S. Attorney's Office, then you should make partner. And so I sort of marched through law review, clerkship, white shoe firm. Then I decided I needed to go to a different firm to get more kind of stand up and argue experience. So I changed firms with the eye of going to the U.S. Attorney's Office. And, some people have really great stories about why they chose to go to the U.S. Attorney's Office. I think mine was less thoughtful. It was, this is kind of what people who I respected had done and suggested I do. And it sounded really cool. And so I thought I would give it a try. And when I got there, I mean, it did feel sort of like a dream come true getting the job. And I was just immediate, you show up and you feel like you have so much responsibility right away. I started on the civil side. I was on the civil side, and then I later moved over to the criminal division. But you start and you just have no idea how to do anything. I mean, you're assigned all these cases. You don't really know the first thing about kind of running your own case start to finish. I was a mid-level associate at a firm just before that, but you still, you get very specialized in firms very quickly. You're kind of doing the same things over and over again. And suddenly you're kind of running the whole show. You're almost like a solo practitioner when you join the U.S. Attorney's Office. And, the camaraderie is great. But I think one of the most stressful things at first is you go into court. The judges are very hard on you. They tend to defer to the government a lot. You have a lot of credibility when you walk into court, but the trade-off there is that they're holding your feet to the fire constantly, and they feel like they have to. And so you feel, inexperienced, a little bit bumbling. You get screamed at a lot by judges, and it's hard, go back to my office and cry. I mean, every junior AUSA has that experience of walking into court, getting blasted for something or other. Maybe it wasn't even something that was their fault, but whatever it is, like, the government is always responsible. You learn early on that you have to take responsibility for everything. And so there are a lot of very humbling moments. And then you go back to your office and you beat yourself up again and again and again. At least I did, and a lot of people do. And then you look for a way to kind of clear your head from all of that. And so we would have, Scotch Fridays, liquor cabinets or file cabinets full of liquor, and we'd break it out and we'd tell stories. And that was kind of the way of decompressing from the week, telling the war stories from the week, telling the humiliations of the week, bucking each other up. And in a way, that's kind of how the hard drinking started.
And then what was the experience of being in government that transformed you as a litigator? Like, what was, you went through this experience and you came out on the side. What was different about Jaimie at the end of that experience compared to the beginning of the experience?
What was different was, I would say, my first major trial when I was in government was so high stakes. It was a case against Bank of America. And it was before Judge Rakoff, who's known for moving cases very, very quickly. And it started as a qui tam, as a whistleblower case. And the government often gets a very long time to investigate whistleblower complaints, especially against a large financial institution. Because you can imagine it can take years to do an investigation like that. I was given 6 months to investigate before I had to make a decision to either resolve the case or file suit. So 6 months of investigation, and then we filed suit against the bank, and Judge Rakoff set the trial date for less than a year from the filing of the complaint, which is extraordinarily fast for a civil case of that size. And I later found out that there was something like, we knew that the team on the other side was large just based on the number of attorneys on the docket. But of course, there was an army of lawyers behind the attorneys on the docket as well. And so at our largest, we briefly expanded, I think, to 5 AUSAs on the case. But typically we had a 3 to 4 AUSA team. And we had roughly 100 lawyers on the defense side. And so we were just unbelievably outgunned. We had this impossibly fast litigation schedule. And so there was absolutely no room for error because we had numerous experts in the case. If an expert report were not done properly, if the sampling of the case dealt with defective loans, we had to sample loans and evaluate them. If the sample size was not drawn correctly, there would be no time to redo it, given the pace of discovery and how quickly the trial was approaching. So I worked just the most grueling hours of my life for that really entire year period. And I just remember being nervous all the time because so many of the things that I was doing for that trial, I was doing for the very first time. And it was my very first trial. And I was against Brendan Sullivan, who was he represented Oliver North in the 80s, who's this huge giant of the DC bar. And leading up to the trial, I was reading a book on trial techniques on the subway, like how to lay a foundation for a question, like the basics of trial practice. And I thought, this is so crazy. And not everyone at the U.S. Attorney's Office has an experience like that, where it feels like you feel so inexperienced and you're against such experienced lawyers out of the gate. But you have this dramatic moment where you're like, this is how you grow up as a lawyer. This is how I became an adult lawyer. And this is when I developed the skills that carried me forward. And after that point, I felt like, okay, I can do anything. I can learn anything. It might be scary, but I made it to the other end. We won the trial, and it was a completely transformative year for me professionally.
Tell me some more about that, because you enter, like so many lawyers into government, you entered as an associate and you've come out as a partner. What is that transformation? Can you say some more about like what, it's, I don't think it's as reducible to say like, hey, a mastery over the federal rules of evidence or something like that. Like what is it? Is it some attitude in you, some perspective that, hey, like, I think you're just saying it, that I can take on anything, even if it is scary. That doesn't change, but it's just the attitude of I can take on any problem. That's somewhat internally to you. And then what is it, that firms in assessing you are looking to see to say, yes, you are in fact a partner. I'm sure it's not reducible to how many trials you had or just anything quantitative like that. What do you think is that quality, or what do you think, apart from this trial, like what was the inflection point in you in terms of how you saw yourself and approach work? Is there something you can speak to that's just different that somebody else can assess?
Yeah, I think a lot of it's just a confidence game. I mean, there is a certain level of experience, skill set. Obviously, that's going to be a necessary component in that, but it's never sufficient for somebody to regard you as a partner, of course. I think it's really having that confidence and being able to inspire that confidence in others, where you can command a room and you can tell the client, I can handle this for you. Here's what I propose to do. Here's the result I believe we can get. And you inspire that trust and confidence. I think that's what firms look for in making a partner.
Hmm. And then were you active in the white collar bar as U.S. attorney, or did you get active in that after you became a partner?
After I left.
Mm-hmm. Is that common? I don't know if it's common at all for U.S. attorneys to be part of white collar events, or maybe they'll speak at them, but I'm not really familiar with the level.
Right. It's typically people in the defense bar, but they'll have sometimes some supervisors from the U.S. Attorney's Office sometimes come and speak or attend select events. But they're not often there because a lot of times we're talking about the challenges of dealing with the government.
Mm-hmm. We had talked a little bit before about the white collar bar, and I practiced in a pretty small bar, the Hatch-Waxman bar, which is like a subset of patent litigation. And so there's a lot of advantage to being in a specialist bar. But I'm curious to spend a little more time on that, because I think it was very interesting to learn about the nature of the white collar bar and the work. I think it'd be insightful for a lot of people who are earlier or somewhere in the middle of their experience to start thinking about how they fit into that. So can you talk a little more about, compared to your commercial litigation counterparts down the hall, what are some of the differences that you've observed in the white collar bar versus commercial litigation?
The commercial litigation bar is just much, much larger. So I think there are fewer, you don't have the repeat player factor the way you do in a smaller bar like the white collar bar. So your reputation just follows you much more easily in the white collar bar. You have a lot of repeat players. Prosecutors will always ask, if somebody, when I was in AUSA and somebody calls me up and says, I represent so-and-so, can we talk about this case? I would always look them up. I would see, were they in the U.S. Attorney's Office? I would ask my friends about them. Do you know this person? How are they to deal with? Are they credible? Right? You want to know, should I give this person a meeting? And if so, how much time should I give them? Are they going to try to play me? Are they going to be straight with me? That sort of thing. So your reputation really matters. You want to deal with people fairly because you are a repeat player with the government, with your fellow defense counsel in a joint defense group, things like that. The joint defense group only works if the fellow members of the group trust you to share information with you. And if they're sharing information with you, you can better advocate for your client, obviously. But in the commercial litigation context, I mean, sometimes you have joint defense agreements, but it's just such a sprawling bar that I think you can get away with being sharp-elbowed for a longer period of time.
Can you say some more about that dynamic of what it is that a white collar lawyer can engage the government on to learn about, and then what are some of the gamesmanship involved that you're looking to avoid? Tell me some more about that dynamic, because I think that's, for people outside of white collar practice, I think that's kind of a black box. I don't really understand, like, what is there to learn? Like for myself, I only did commercial litigation, so there's a complaint. It's a publicly available document unless it's, there's something, that needs to be redacted or whatever. But broadly speaking, it's a public process and transparent in that way. So can you speak some more about, what it is that these lawyers are looking to assess, and tell me some more about how credibility and reputation play in both among members of the white collar bar, and then between the government.
Right. So, especially if you are primarily doing investigations, so which is what I do. So the whole game is to prevent somebody from getting charged, because once your client is criminally charged, even if they go to trial and they prevail, right, they've already suffered so much reputational damage. And so that's really what especially white collar defendants generally want to avoid, is getting charged in the first place. But when you're at the investigation stage, there's no discovery that you can engage in. It's such an information game, and the only way you're going to get information out of the government at that stage is basically by having a relationship, having rapport, convincing them to just voluntarily share information with you. They don't have to share anything with you at all. So I can call them up and say, I represent Jane Doe in this matter. What can you tell me? They might just say, well, we can't really share anything at this point. And I can't force it. Then that's where we are. I go back to my client. They're not going to be very happy. Like, what do you mean? You can't tell me anything at all that they're looking at? Or it can be, well, Jaimie, let me tell you, we've spoken to a lot of people. We think your client's in a bad spot, and here's why, and blah, 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 and share all this information with me, to just give me a sense of the strength of the case. And they can say, they can do what's called a reverse proffer, where they call you in, especially if they want to resolve the matter in some way. They can call you in and basically share, in detail, the evidence against the client, which allows you to then consult with your client and make a much more informed decision. They can say, all right, we'll do a reverse proffer, and then we're happy to hear from you, some sort of counter presentation of why you think that we shouldn't charge. And again, they don't have to allow you to do that. They typically will allow that as a courtesy, especially if you are an alum of that U.S. Attorney's Office. It's sort of a professional courtesy that they would extend. But all of those little things, it's kind of, just a system of courtesies that they don't have to allow, but they will allow if they think you're not going to abuse the process, if they think that you are a credible person, and you're not somehow going to twist it against them. So that's why all of those little things they really matter, especially if the government is pretty dug in and you want to go in and tell them, I know you guys have spent a year on this case, but here's why you've got it all wrong, and here's why you shouldn't charge, right? Like that's a pretty big ask, because, there's sunk costs and all of that might be at play at that point. Agents can be very dug in, even apart from how the AUSA feels about the case, and the agents can be pushing the AUSA really hard. So you just want everything that you can get that will allow for you to get additional information out of the government and for the government to give you a fair hearing before they make a charging decision.
What's the payoff to a U.S. attorney for sharing information? So, I'm in private practice. I'm looking for the government to share some information. How do I frame it for the benefit of the government to share that information?
For a responsible AUSA, they want to get it right too. I mean, some people can just be hyper aggressive and dug in no matter what, but generally they want to get it right and they don't want to be embarrassed. They don't want to charge a case that's going to blow up in their faces. And so if they think you have something that will allow them to reach the right result, that's in their interest too.
Mm-hmm.
Right. The flip side, but cynically, sometimes they might want to know their weaknesses to see if they can then make their case stronger, which is why some people don't like to share a lot of information on the defense side with the government, because their view is, look, they're just whatever holes I poke in their case, they're just going to plug through other means
Sure.
and then still bring the case.
Sure. Yeah. And then saying commercial litigation analogy might be, rather than deposing a witness and making clear like the reason, you're just inferring the fault lines that you're trying to establish for that witness, just examine them at trial to show right then and there, hey, here's the weaknesses with this person's credibility or theory.
Right.
So then, so you return to private practice and, you're part of a small bar, but certainly is competition among your peers. How do you differentiate yourself? So what has differentiated your approach compared to other peers with comparable experience?
I'm not sure I've ever done anything intentionally to sort of pitch in terms of as compared with my peers from the U.S. Attorney's Office. Like, I can't think of a pitch where I've said, here's why you should hire me instead of, somebody else. And I don't tend to pitch in white collar defense work anyway. I think because I guess what I've always said to clients is it's just a very personal choice. There are lots of excellent white collar lawyers out there with very similar, and I think this is true, with very similar backgrounds, right? There are lots. The U.S. Attorney's Office is a very big place. There are lots of us who come out every year with great credentials. And I think ultimately the decision for a client is, do I feel comfortable with this person? Am I going to be able to share everything I need to share with this person so that they can really advise me? Do I trust their manner, demeanor, messaging, that I think they can properly represent me and represent me the way I want to be represented, right? And for everybody, that's going to be different. Some people want a softer approach. Some people want like bulldog from start to finish. And that's just going to be a personality fit.
It sounds like that is highly unique to that. Like, I can't think of the practice that's so personal in that way. And it makes sense, right? Because some of the people that are charged, this is their liberty is at stake here, their credit, their reputation, which, as you say, even if a charge isn't proven, it still has a stain.
Right.
And yeah, so it makes sense as it's an intensely personal process then. So, I guess then that means that you're probably leaning in more to yourself and how you are as a person. There's just probably such a nexus between your personality and your practice. So can you say some more about what is your personality then? When somebody is considering, you mentioned maybe one person's a bulldog, one person isn't. Okay, those are different dimensions. What is it you think that people tend to be drawn to you and really resonate with you on?
I think people find that I really listen to them, and I think that's really important, that I will listen patiently to their account of what happened and think very, very hard about all the angles in terms of how to message to the government. And so I think people often want a lawyer who really listens and understands their perspective. And I think that people find me earnest and credible, and they expect that the government will view me the same way. And then that judges view me that way as well, that I'm straightforward and candid, and that if the same things come out of my mouth that come out of someone else's mouth that might be a little bit less trustworthy or be regarded as a little bit less earnest, that obviously I can be a more effective advocate for them. But I would say it's really just being myself, that they connect with the fact that I will listen to them. I will take their strategy ideas very seriously as well. And I will package them as earnestly and effectively as I can.
I can tell that you do that from this conversation, because if I ask you a question, you'll pause. You heard me, you're thinking about it, and then you're willing to say, oh, I hadn't thought maybe some aspect of this or whatever. So that really tells me you are listening to me. So I find that effective. You mentioned storytelling. And so I'm thinking of, I did another podcast interview with Neil Chatterjee, who's a patent litigator. He's had a number of jury trials. And so he's been on both sides of the V in patent litigation. And he says, no matter what side of the V that I'm on, my position is that we're always representing the innovator. Like, we are always going to tell a story about how we are the innovator here. And so are there principles of storytelling that you have for your clients so that's a story that maybe a jury would find persuasive? Like, okay, yes, that's the innovator and that's relevant for this legal cause of action. Are there patterns of stories that you find helpful for the government for persuasively, seeing your clients in a beneficial way?
Yeah, I mean, there are. I'm sort of hesitating to say it because I think, well, if somebody from the government hears this, are they going to think then this is somehow a ploy? This is just her pattern. But I would say I have had a number of cases in recent years where I was advancing a theory and a message that on its face would seem quite far-fetched. Where it was essentially a version of you've just got it all wrong. The person you're looking at it as the target is really the victim here. Some version of that story. But I 100% believed that is what happened. And I had success in turning the government's view based on just building, receipt by receipt, why that was the case. And it took some time. But I would say, even though it was sort of a seemingly preposterous theory to advance to the government, right, to tell them, when they think they're rarely wrong, like, you've got it all wrong and you have target and victim in the wrong buckets here. That would also be something that would be very embarrassing to get wrong to the government. And so I think in those cases, my credibility really helped, that I got any kind of hearing at all in those cases.
It also seems to me that, reflecting now on the nature of your work and how much it is about doubling down on your persuasiveness and authenticity, it just seems like in that context, it almost seems obvious disrupting drinking. Because I mean, just like, that is just, you by profession are somebody who deeply personalizes stories and contextualizes and say, hey, this is a real person's life at stake here. And then helping the government understand what's at stake for this person and what they did or didn't do. So in that sense, like, these like hyper personal stories that are persuasive, like, it just seems, well, obviously that would be helpful for you to do that in other contexts too. So just, do you see a connection between your approach to work and how you're thinking about communicating through disrupting drinking.
Yes. Yes. I'm not sure I did before you said that, but I think that's sort of, yeah. I mean, now that you've said that, I think that's almost a theme through my life, sort of stories that I grew up on that really impacted me, or just sort of the power of storytelling through my childhood. Because, my parents, I grew up in a pretty religious household. And so, my parents really wanted us to read the Bible and stuff like that. There was, church every Sunday. So I had sort of that world of Bible stories. On the other hand, my father was really into pro wrestling. So I grew up really on like the stories of the Bible and the pro wrestling, right? And in some ways, like both of those kind of came together in my trial work too, sort of the concept of showmanship and the good versus evil narratives and all of that. And I think that sort of the power of storytelling, as I'm reflecting on it, that's been kind of a theme of my life.
I was just picturing my head like, and then Vince McMahon, Big Gat, and then just, going through that list of Big Gats for that family. Yeah, that's, yeah, I think, so I guess I'm curious now in this stage of your career, what story about yourself? It sounds like historically you've challenged stories about yourself or the stories that were you accepted from the world. Can you share some of those stories that you challenged over time? Like what are some of the stories about yourself and how you fit in that you challenged? You mentioned in terms of fitting into, hey, like I'm now in the world of big law as a summer associate. So maybe there's some stories there. And then some stories that you had for yourself, heading into the U.S. Attorney's Office and making sense there. Are there in these different eras of your life, can you think of stories in the past that you challenged that found a new story on the other side of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest one was I grew up just temperamentally. I'm very shy and introverted, or was growing up, and some of that has faded over time. But I just avoided public speaking wherever I could growing up, and really through college. Dropping classes that required speaking, or trying to skip if it was a high participation class. And even early in my, I tried to kind of fight through it in law school, tried to participate and things like that. But because I sort of had this feeling that I could be good at trial work, but I was so petrified of public speaking, and I would, battle just not just nerves, but like nausea and nightmares, and, really felt kind of phobic about public speaking. And when I was a junior associate and we had a mock trial exercise at my first law firm, and my partner mentor said, you should really do this. It would be great for you. And I said, okay, I'm going to do this. And then I just got so wound up with nerves that I just sort of told the program organizer, I can't do that. I'll do this next year, whatever. I made up some excuse. I'm too busy, and just sort of dropped out of it. And I could tell my partner mentor was disappointed. And I thought, all right, well, I guess that's it. I'll never be a trial lawyer. I'll never go to the U.S. Attorney's Office. And I just thought, I'll just be a quiet behind the desk lawyer. I guess that's what I'm meant to do. And then I don't know. And then I can't really think of a clear pivot point, but I just decided, well, what if I just did it anyway? What if I just kind of got over it? What if I just applied and did it little by little? And of course, that's all it takes. And the first time I did an oral argument, I was up most of the night with nausea and was, worried about my voice shaking in court and all that. But I got through it, and the adrenaline on the back end was so great that it sort of made all the nerves worth it. And I think that's when I then started to get hooked on, okay, even though I'm much more outgoing now than I was as a kid, everybody battles nerves with public speaking, but I guess I see the reward. I see the reward both in terms of connecting with the audience and how meaningful that can be, whether it's jury or law students or whoever, but also just that excitement and that adrenaline on the back end is so satisfying.
It's interesting because I also have always, I historically have thought of myself as being very introverted, and I was just talking to my wife this weekend about how funny a profession I've chosen as a legal recruiter is, because I'm on phone calls all day. As a litigator, I'd have my door shut mostly and just be working on whatever, discovery issues or briefs or whatever. It was very solitary. I enjoyed connection through, bar associations and that kind of stuff. But I was, very solitary historically, and didn't have any training to be on tons of phone calls. So I'm just on tons of phone calls all the time. And it's intensely social in that way, in a way that, I don't consider myself to be an extroverted person who, and then, my role also involves, persuasion, sales. And so that also I'm not natural to those things at all. I'm not like a charisma driven person who just naturally is, oh, of course that person's in that function. So, I've also had to work. I've chosen to work against type, and I'm really proud of myself for doing that. And it's funny because you mentioned connection with your audience, and that's really interesting takeaway from public speaking, because it could be very surprising to think, oh, it's a very distant experience where there's a public speaker audience and it's very separateness, and you're speaking to this general large room and your voice is booming, and it's a one-way street largely. But in my history, going back to say even high school, I found that even though I was, and then way more introverted, I've always enjoyed public speaking because for what you just described is that intimacy. And so I should also add, like, hosting podcasts, this is a one-on-one conversation. This is like probably my favorite 2 or 3 people. It's like my favorite format for communicating, for really understanding other people. But yeah, I found that public speaking is a surprising good way to do that at scale, where, it wouldn't seem obvious that an introvert could really enjoy public speaking, but I think that's what you're communicating, so you've experienced it as well.
Right. Yeah, because you're talking really to a bunch of individuals at the end of the day when you're in the moment in public speaking. And what you look for is that recognition on someone's face when they go, when you see a little bit of an emotional shift in them, or something resonating, and it is like you're back having a one-on-one conversation.
So we're talking about stories and how we challenge those stories over time. So today, what is the story about yourself that you're challenging?
Hmm. I guess that I'm not exactly sure how to frame it, but I think as lawyers, we're very often safety seekers and sort of, reputationally conservative and all that, sort of concerned what the market will think, what people will think, all of those sorts of concerns. And I feel like I've sort of dropped that, and I kind of had to drop that in order to do this whole project. And some of it was it just sort of felt like the next chapter of my life. And I've been listening a lot to, I don't know how I got into this, but I started reading and listening to death doulas, who are just like birth doulas, but they guide people basically in hospice who are are very near death. And they are very positive people. And they have all these great life lessons about, what people say at the end of life and what their top regrets are and things like that. And one of the top regrets that comes up again and again that this one death doula mentioned is that people say, I just wish I hadn't cared so much what everyone thought. I cared so much what other people thought, and I was never authentic as a result. And I think as lawyers, it's very easy to be like that. We're in such a conservative profession, And it's not like I've just thrown caution to the wind or I don't care what anybody thinks, but when faced with a choice of I can do this thing and maybe there will be some reputational blowback, but there really A, shouldn't be, and B, whatever's the blowback to me, I am 100% certain that this can help other people. And so I'm going to make the choice to help other people. And I don't know that, I mean, and I have a certain amount of luxury and I'm at a point in my career where I can do that too. You can't ask somebody who's up for partner to make the same choice. It's just not realistic. But if those of us who are sort of in leadership positions now in firms can't do that, can't share these kind of stories, then who can in the profession? Really no one. Do we have to wait until we retire to tell these kind of stories? That seems really unfortunate and doesn't send the right message. I want to be able to say, you can share this story and the world, an anvil won't fall on your head. Your clients won't run out the door. Everything's fine. We can have these conversations and it's so beneficial to the industry.
Yeah, I really like that. I think the North Star of, hey, as long as I'm being helpful, there really can't be any risk in that is a great message. And then I also think it's a great message that, this can be this incremental approach. This isn't this all or nothing. And yeah, I think, in your role, it could cut in both directions where people could feel they have a lot to lose now. Like, hey, like now I worked so hard to become partner and now this is the thing I have to lose. So I actually think you deserve, recognition for that you are taking this step in a phase where others would actually, I think, could choose or maybe even choose to, be more conservative about it. Yeah, I felt for myself, I went to a law school that, big law doesn't recruit out of, and I ended up in big law and I always felt for myself that was such a blessing for me because I didn't have the attachment to that identity, that other of my peers, like if I went to Harvard or Yale, I could imagine all the pressure I'd be putting on myself based on my peers, based on my perception of myself and say, hey, why did you do that thing? Why did you achieve that credential? It was for this narrow set of options for you. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot of gratification from removing identity. There's a writer, investor, Paul Graham, who talks about, he's got a great essay. I think the title of the essay is Keep Your Identity Small. And, I haven't read it in a while, but that's my recollection takeaway of it is the fewer things that you, connect yourself to. I think Bruce Lee also talked about this in Jeet Kune Do. I think that's the empty fist is referring to is if you've got a knife in your hand, you do knife things with it. But if you have an empty hand, you can do anything with it. And so on that topic, I saw that you are also part of a board for wrestling. I think it's encouraging women in wrestling. Can you talk some more about that? Because that also seems pretty iconoclastic. And tell me some more about your role in that and your advocacy for women's wrestling.
Yeah. So I mean, I love strength building overall for women. I just find it very physically empowering and I like lifting weights and have tried since I quit drinking, did different, like a kind of women's fight camp in DC and some Krav Maga and stuff like that and raised my daughters in CrossFit for a while. And then we tried different sports, but I think that gave them some early strength and confidence. And my older daughter she was like 13, 14 during COVID and was having a pretty tough time, like a lot of teen girls were. And initially I got her she had mentioned before COVID about trying boxing lessons. And so I got her some boxing lessons with a female trainer. And she very quickly, like I noticed a change in her after just a couple lessons. It seemed to really be pulling her out of, some of what was bothering her during COVID. And then when she started high school, I encouraged her to try out for the wrestling team and she got on and it completely transformed her. I mean, she had some talent in it, but she loved just this crew of women who were all, obviously all different body shapes and sizes because you have all these different weight classes. So it sends the message of you can be strong and powerful and athletic in a variety of sizes. Not everybody's trying to be 100 pounds or 110 pounds. she's, taking pride in her big, strong legs and stuff like that. She's not, when I was growing up in the 80s, everybody wanted to have like thin thighs and stuff like that. And this was a whole different mindset that I thought was so positive. And she just changed, just the way she moved through the world was different. She's just started moving through the world with such confidence. And so my younger daughter, who's now a sophomore in high school, she ended up, when she got into high school, trying out for wrestling as well, and had the same experience with it. And I've just watched it, the effect it's had on both of my daughters, who were also super shy and introverted, just like I was, like really take on this both physical and social confidence that they didn't have before. And the girls wrestling community it's just an incredibly empowering place. It's like there's so much nonsense that teen girls have to deal with in terms of, looking a certain way or whatever. And I feel like wrestling is such a great antidote for that and such a confidence builder. So I got involved with Beat the Streets, which is it's a nationwide organization. I'm involved with the New York chapter, and it's basically a free wrestling club for middle school and high school wrestlers around the city. And they have just fantastic coaches and a fantastic community. And that's why I wanted to be involved with it.
Yeah, I guess first thing I thought about, I mean, it's obvious because we're talking about a handful of things. I'm going to connect it to other things we're talking about, but I'll also be curious there if there's some connection between your experience with that organization, which is taking a new message for a group of people to say, hey, like, maybe historically women have not been in wrestling, but hey, this is really beneficial for all of these different reasons for how it influences how women, girls think of themselves. That, maybe you just at least tacitly got, hey, there's new ideas and new ways you can present, new ways to relate to each other in these communities that are about improving ourselves, that, maybe had some foundation for you for ideas in disrupting drinking.
Wait, can you say that again?
Well, it's possible that, picking up ideas for new ways for people to relate to each other in this one community, mm-hmm. where just the benefit was pretty clear, but it's a new story. It's a new story. Yeah. Women in wrestling, that's a relatively new story, that there's ideas from there that's influenced for you to say, hey, maybe there's new stories in my practice that I can share and help people relate to each other a little bit differently.
Yeah. And I mean, to be honest, I also am just super inspired by watching them wrestle and watching just girls wrestle in general. Whenever I feel nervous about something, I often think about it. I think, whatever, whether it's like starting disrupting, sharing my story, what will people think and what might be the fallout. And I think about my kids just stepping in this circle for physical combat about somebody, and they often wrestle boys too, somebody who is bigger and stronger than they are, and knowing I'm probably going to lose. I'm probably going to get pinned or whatever in front of all these people, but I'm just going to fight my heart out no matter what. Like that's incredible. And that's so moving to me. And I think, yeah, I can take this risk.
Yeah.
No one's coming for me physically.
Yes. Much, much less at stake, not getting pinned in front of the people.
Right.
Well, Jaimie, thanks for coming to share your story. It's really admirable what you're doing. I think it's very interesting. I think it's very compelling, and it's early days for you. So I'm really excited to see where you take this and where else you take your story and your career.
Thanks for having me.